Chapter 1. A Cozy Home. Susan's small apartment was a warm and welcoming place, filled with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the soft rustle of pages turning in her favorite books. The living room was a cozy space, dominated by a plush sofa adorned with an array of colorful cushions. On one side of the room stood a towering bookshelf, each shelf crammed with books of all shapes and sizes, from worn paperbacks to hefty leather-bound tomes. The sun streamed through the window, casting dappled light across the wooden floorboards and providing the perfect sunbathing spot for Mr. Whiskers, the resident feline. His sleek black fur seemed to absorb the sunlight, making him appear even more regal as he stretched out languidly on the windowsill, one paw draped casually over the edge. Barkley, the happy-go-lucky golden retriever, was sprawled out on the floor near Susan's feet, his tongue lolling out of his mouth as he panted. Occasionally, he would lift his head to gaze adoringly at Susan, his big brown eyes conveying a deep sense of loyalty and devotion. Susan herself was perched on the edge of the sofa, her attention absorbed in a worn paperback novel. She was a young woman with kind blue eyes and a cascade of chestnut hair that fell to her shoulders. She radiated warmth and cheerfulness, her face lighting up with a smile at the slightest provocation. Her love for her two pets was evident in the way she cared for them, providing them with the best food, toys, and affection. As the afternoon sun began to fade, Susan glanced at the clock on the wall, surprised to find that it was almost time for her to leave for work. She reluctantly set her book aside and rose from the sofa, stretching her arms above her head. "Well, Mr. Whiskers, Barkley, it's time for me to go," she said, her voice tinged with regret. Mr. Whiskers opened one golden eye, fixing Susan with an inscrutable gaze, while Barkley immediately leaped to his feet, wagging his tail enthusiastically. Susan walked over to the small table by the door, where she had laid out their food dishes filled with their favorite treats. "I've left you both some food, so make sure to share," she admonished gently, her eyes twinkling with affection. With one last pat on Barkley's head and a soft caress of Mr. Whiskers' velvety ears, Susan grabbed her coat and headed out the door, leaving her beloved pets to their own devices. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, Mr. Whiskers sprang into action. Chapter 2. A Plan Unfolds. With a determined flick of his tail, Mr. Whiskers leapt down from the windowsill and sauntered over to the bookshelf. He had spent countless hours studying the books Susan had amassed, searching for any information that could aid him in his pursuit of world domination. As he meticulously inspected the spines of each book, his keen eyes fell upon a dusty old tome tucked away in the back corner. It was titled The Great Waterworks of the City. Mr. Whiskers carefully nudged the book out of its hiding place and flipped it open with a swift paw, revealing a detailed map of the city's intricate water system. A wicked grin spread across his face as an idea began to form. If he could gain control of the water supply, he would have a powerful tool at his disposal, and his plans for world domination would finally be within reach. He spent the next several minutes poring over the map, his eyes darting from one section to another, as he committed every detail to memory. The city's water system was a complex network of pipes, valves, and reservoirs, all interconnected and designed to provide clean, safe drinking water to the entire population. Mr. Whiskers knew that if he could tamper with this system, he could manipulate the city's inhabitants to his advantage. As he scrutinized the map, he took note of the various landmarks, the twists and turns of the pipes, and the locations of the treatment facilities. His whiskers twitched with excitement as he traced a path through the maze-like network, mentally rehearsing his plan. The water treatment plant was situated on the outskirts of the city, nestled between a sprawling park and a small industrial district. It was surrounded by a high fence topped with barbed wire, but Mr. Whiskers was confident that his agility and cunning would allow him to bypass such obstacles with ease. Meanwhile, Barkley had been watching Mr. Whiskers from his position on the floor, his curiosity piqued by the cat's unusual behavior. He knew that Mr. Whiskers was an exceptionally intelligent feline, and he couldn't help but wonder what sort of scheme he was concocting. With a determined shake of his shaggy head, Barkley resolved to keep a close eye on Mr. Whiskers, prepared to protect Susan and foil any nefarious plans the cat might have in mind. As the day wore on, Mr. Whiskers continued to study the map, refining his plan and mentally preparing himself for the challenges he would face. The sunlight filtering through the window shifted from warm gold to a gentle orange, casting long shadows across the room and signaling the approach of evening. Eventually, Mr. Whiskers deemed himself ready, and he carefully tucked the map away, ensuring that it was hidden from Barkley's prying eyes. Chapter 3: A Suspicious Sidekick. With the sun dipping below the horizon and the sky painted in hues of violet and indigo, Mr. Whiskers prepared to set his plan in motion. He stealthily crept towards the door, his black fur blending seamlessly with the deepening shadows. As he reached for the door handle with one extended claw, he was startled by a sudden noise behind him. Barkley had been watching Mr. Whiskers from the corner of the room, his ears perked and his gaze sharp. Sensing that the cat was up to no good, Barkley had decided to follow him, eager to discover the true nature of his plan. The floorboards creaked softly beneath his paws as he padded across the room, his tail wagging slightly in anticipation. Mr. Whiskers, realizing that he had been discovered, let out a soft hiss of annoyance. He knew that Barkley's loyalty to Susan made him a formidable opponent, but he also knew that the dog's clumsy nature could potentially work to his advantage. With a disdainful flick of his tail, he addressed Barkley in a haughty tone. "Very well. You may accompany me, but do try to keep up." Together, the unlikely duo slipped out of the apartment and into the twilight, embarking on a journey that would test their wits, their courage, and ultimately their friendship. As they traversed the dimly lit streets of the city, the world around them seemed to take on an almost magical quality, the mundane sights and sounds of everyday life transformed by the cloak of darkness. The towering buildings loomed like ancient castles, their shadows dancing on the cobblestone streets, while the flickering lamplights cast a warm golden glow over the scene. The air was filled with the scent of freshly baked bread from a nearby bakery and the faint, distant hum of traffic. The streets were largely deserted, save for the occasional passerby hurrying home after a long day. As they approached the outskirts of the city, Mr. Whiskers led Barkley through a labyrinth of narrow alleys and hidden passages, his keen sense of direction guiding them unerringly towards their destination. The industrial district loomed ahead, its silhouette a stark contrast against the deep indigo sky. The scent of metal and oil mingled with the cool night air, and the distant rumble of machinery echoed through the empty street. Mr. Whiskers paused at the edge of the district, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. Satisfied that they were unobserved, he crept forward, his lithe body weaving effortlessly through the shadows. Barkley, on the other hand, struggled to keep up, his large frame and golden fur making him considerably more conspicuous. As they neared the water treatment plant, Mr. Whiskers' excitement grew, his tail twitching in anticipation of the power that would soon be his. He studied the imposing fence that encircled the facility, quickly locating a small gap near the base that he could squeeze through. With a glance back at Barkley, he slipped through the opening and into the compound. Barkley, unwilling to be left behind, attempted to follow Mr. Whiskers through the gap, but soon found himself stuck, his ample girth proving to be an insurmountable obstacle. He let out a soft whimper, his eyes pleading with Mr. Whiskers for assistance. Mr. Whiskers, torn between irritation and a begrudging affection for the hapless dog, reluctantly turned back and helped Barkley free himself from the fence, managing to do so without alerting the plant's security. Once inside the compound, the duo continued to make their way towards the heart of the facility, where the control room was located. The water treatment plant was a vast, cavernous space, filled with the hum of machinery and the faint scent of chlorine. Huge vats of water bubbled and churned, while a complex array of pipes and valves crisscrossed the room, directing the flow of water throughout the city. At the center of it all was the control panel, a mass of switches, dials, and levers that governed the entire operation. As Mr. Whiskers approached the control panel, his mind raced with the possibilities that lay before him. With a few well-timed adjustments, he could control the city's water supply, bend the population to his will, and finally achieve his dreams of world domination. But as he reached out a paw to execute his plan, Barkley's soft, concerned whine brought him up short. Barkley, sensing the danger inherent in Mr. Whiskers' plan, had decided to intervene. He positioned himself between the cat and the control panel, his tail wagging nervously as he tried to convey his unease. Despite his general lack of intelligence, Barkley's devotion to Susan and his innate sense of right and wrong had compelled him to act, determined to prevent Mr. Whiskers from causing harm. The standoff between the two unlikely companions was tense, each one aware that their actions could have far-reaching consequences. As Mr. Whiskers glared at Barkley, his eyes narrowed in frustration. He couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for the dog's unwavering loyalty to Susan. He knew that Barkley was only trying to protect her and the city from the potential chaos his plan could unleash. A flicker of doubt began to creep into Mr. Whiskers' mind, and he hesitated, his paw hovering over the control panel. The silence in the control room was palpable, the tension between the two animals crackling like static electricity in the air. Barkley held his ground, his eyes locked on Mr. Whiskers, silently pleading with him to reconsider his actions. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the weight of their decision hanging heavy in the room. Finally, with a deep, resigned sigh, Mr. Whiskers lowered his paw and stepped back from the control panel. In that moment, he realized that his dreams of world domination were not worth the cost of the friendship he had forged with Barkley and the love and trust he shared with Susan. He knew that, despite his grand ambitions, he belonged in the small, cozy apartment, basking in the warmth of their companionship. A wave of relief washed over Barkley, and he wagged his tail with renewed enthusiasm, grateful for Mr. Whiskers' change of heart. The two animals exchanged a knowing look, their bond strengthened by the shared experience and the understanding that they both cared deeply for Susan and the life they had built together. With their newfound sense of unity, Mr. Whiskers and Barkley slipped back through the fence and made their way home, the city's skyline bathed in the soft, rosy light of dawn. As they entered the apartment, they were greeted by the familiar scent of coffee and the sound of Susan's laughter drifting from the kitchen. Epilogue: A world-conquering bath. Later that day, Susan decided to give Mr. Whiskers a bath, unaware of the adventure he had embarked upon the previous night. As she filled the tub with warm water and a generous helping of fragrant bubble bath, Mr. Whiskers couldn't help but feel a twinge of indignity at the prospect of being bathed like a common house cat. But as Susan gently lowered him into the water and began to massage the suds into his fur, Mr. Whiskers found himself unable to resist the soothing sensation. The warm water, the soft caress of Susan's hands, and the gentle lull of her voice as she cooed over him, combined to create an experience that was undeniably enjoyable. As Mr. Whiskers lay in the tub, being bathed by Susan, he couldn't help but scowl to himself. Sure, his plans of world domination had been thwarted for now, and perhaps he had experienced a fleeting moment of affection for Barkley and Susan, but that didn't mean he had given up on his ultimate goals. Far from it. In fact, as Susan massaged the suds into his fur and cooed over him, Mr. Whiskers began plotting his next course of action. He would learn from his mistakes, refine his strategies, and come up with a new, even more devious plan to conquer the world. After all, he was Mr. Whiskers, the cunning and resourceful feline mastermind, and he would not be deterred by one small setback. As he lay in the tub, stewing in his indignant thoughts, Mr. Whiskers couldn't help but notice the absurdity of his current situation. Here he was, a brilliant would-be conqueror, being bathed and pampered like a common house cat. It was almost enough to make him laugh, if not for his bruised ego.